Hi students, this week we will be discussing Friedrich Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals. We just finished talking about the death of God with Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard and Sartre. We have this idea that our relationship to the divine or our relationship to transcendent, universal principles has kind of been rearranged. We now have to figure out what is good, what we're supposed to do as moral people who care about others in the world, and we don't really have a sort of omnipotent God to look to anymore. So even with Dostoevsky and with Kierkegaard, who believe in God, they find God to be very sort of mysterious and paradoxical and not necessarily giving us straightforward commandments for what we're supposed to do in life. And so that means we have to reevaluate what our values are. If we're not deriving morality directly from God, if He's not telling us exactly what to do, what do we do with our lives? How do we find meaning? How do we be good people in this world? So I asked you to watch this video that gives you some background information about Nietzsche, his other philosophy, his life, and how it all comes together. And he is a German 19th century philosopher. One of the ideas that was emphasized in the video was this notion of Selbstüberwindung, which means self-overcoming. He really thinks that life is meant to be challenging and it's meant to change and transform who we are. And for Nietzsche, the greatest strength that a person can have is the ability to change one's perspective. We're supposed to continually learn and grow and become new people throughout life. And if we're not changing who we are, if we're not growing, he thinks that's kind of a sign that we're dead. He does not believe in being timid. I'm sure you noticed in the reading that he makes lots of provocative statements. He thinks that we should live passionately and dangerously. He was very critical of education. He thought that a lot of people were just memorizing information from books and not really thinking about its meaning for life. And he also was very critical of religious values. And he thought we need values in our life. We need some sense of meaning. We need some sense of purpose. We need some sort of guidance for how we're supposed to live. And he believed that due to secularization and the sort of fall of religion from power, we weren't getting that from religion anymore. Science had kind of stepped in the way of religion and showed us that the origins of the universe are different than a creator God. And he thought that we need to replace the role that religion played with culture. Things like philosophy, art, and literature can give us guidance in life. So the title On the Genealogy of Morals is Nietzsche describing a new method for thinking about morality, which he calls genealogy. Now, Nietzsche was trained as a philologist, which literally means a lover of language. And that meant he was reading really old Greco-Roman texts in Greek and Latin and studying a lot of ancient history. And so he was a historian. He's sort of what we would consider a classicist. And he used history in a way that is very different than a lot of historians think of history. He used history to trace back the origins of particular ideas and practices and show kind of how strange they are. So there's a lot of ideas. There's some notions that we consider to be universal and timeless, like human, right? What does it mean to be human? That's probably been the same across history. Or good and evil, we take those to kind of be universal sometimes. And Nietzsche's like, actually, these ideas are not universal at all. They have a really long history that shows how much they've changed over time. And we forget where these ideas originally came from. So if history is kind of like a laboratory or a place where ideas get invented and put into practice, when we actually look at what's happening in the laboratory, or we look at how the sausage is made, whatever metaphor works for you, we see that it's very different than what we have right now. They're contingent, they're not universal, they have strange origins, and the past makes us look at the present in a very different way. So he's asking this question in the genealogy of morals: what is the origin of the idea good and evil? Where did these ideas come from? And if you're thinking about the history of Western civilization, you might think, oh, well, this comes from the Ten Commandments, Moses and the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament. This seems to give us a sense of right or wrong, right? Don't lie, don't steal, don't steal your neighbor's wife. Like all these different morals, they seem to have stood up the test of time. And, we get this from religion. And Nietzsche isn't thinking of morals as something we get from God on a tablet. He's not thinking of them necessarily being derived from religion either. He gives us a very different story of where morals come from. And at first, he kind of addresses a very sort of rationalist concept of morality. He says that English psychologists, so his contemporaries who are trying to figure out, well, how did humans invent morality? So again, it's a non-religious, it's a secular concept of morality. But as Sartre pointed out to us, a lot of secular concepts of morality instigate sort of other universal sources of morality. They're trying to derive morality from some sort of human nature or some sort of universal reason so that it in fact is the same as if God gave them to us. So English psychologists really think that we get the concept of good from unegoistic actions, people doing things for other people that benefit those other people and do not benefit the person doing the good deed. That's what a moral action is. It can't benefit you. And so it's something that does serve a purpose. It has utility in society. It ensures that people do good things for each other. And it kind of, ends up creating social goods. So this is the concept of morality, is that it's sort of a self-sacrificing, unegoistic, altruistic action that benefits others and is good for society. And Nietzsche's like, well, that's not really where morality comes from. That's a nice idea. But if we look at history, if we use genealogy and we trace something back to its origin, right? Like in genealogy, you trace back your ancestry to figure out who your great, 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 great grandparents are. And he's doing that with this idea of good and evil. And he shows us that if we actually look at language and we give the etymology for these words, we find a very different story. It doesn't come from unegoistic action. In fact, it comes from huge egos. It comes from the aristocracy. So if we look at the German word for bad, schlecht, it comes from schlicht, which means plain or common. And so evil or bad is the idea of a commoner, someone who is low in society or plebeian. And if you look at the word for good, it has to do with the aristocracy, the upper class. And we have all these sayings that kind of indicate that, right? If I say I'm going to do something good instead of bad, I'll say I'm taking the high road, right? Which can sound condescending and like I'm elevating myself. And so a lot of sort of concepts of morality actually come from, what do the people in power think was good? So originally morality was determined by those who had power, those who had class status. And we like to think maybe we've overcome this type of morality. But if you look on Twitter, this was a really popular tweet. Someone asked the question, what's considered trashy if you're poor but classy if you're rich? And people came up with a lot of answers. This got retweeted and commented on a lot. And so things like day drinking, right? Really classy if you're having a fancy mimosa at brunch in the Mediterranean, right? Super classy. If you're, sitting on a sidewalk drinking beer out of a bag, maybe not. And so we make these sort of evaluations about what's good or bad. Like speaking two languages, right? That's a sign that you're probably an immigrant. But when people from upper class do it, that's considered classy and not something that's suspicious, right? No one's going to yell at a person who's upper class and tell them to speak English if they're speaking a different language in public, right? So there's lots of different examples of things we can think of where they actually have more to do with class than actually being inherently good or bad. And so when we think of morality as being universal and saying this is good in all instances for all people, it's useful, it's good for society, and we take class out of it, we're probably not looking at exactly the way morality is operating. So Nietzsche shows us that there's a power structure to morality. It's not about usefulness, it's actually about power dynamics. So then he talks about how the idea of morality kind of changed in history. Instead of having aristocracy determining what's good or bad, like noble people, you suddenly have a priestly class. So these were people who would have had religious power and authority, but not necessarily a lot of money. And he says that instead of values becoming about class, they become about who is pure and who is impure. And he talks kind of about the ascetic lifestyle of a religious person, right? So if you're a priest, you'd be denying sex. You would have to wear plain clothes. You would not be wearing a lot of jewels and stuff. You would fast a lot. The types of food you eat would be very controlled. And all of this would be something that would help you have a certain sense of purity. And it's all about denying materiality and denying things that appeal to your senses. So it's anti-sensual. And Nietzsche says this is actually very unhealthy and life-denying. In fact, he thinks this sort of priestly values, saying things like you need to fast to be a good person, or you need to not be sexual, you need to deny your sexual urges to be a good person. He thinks that that's really unhealthy because those are aspects of life and those are important aspects of life. And he thinks that this expresses a sort of hatred. He says it was on the soil of the essentially dangerous form of human existence. And it's dangerous because it has a sort of life denying hatred of what is human to it. We get this priestly form. And he says, though, there's kind of this, even though we can look at this and he says it's life denying, he's not saying it's entirely bad because he says this makes us interesting. The invention of priestly values gives us depth, and it gives us this distinction between good and evil and this sort of inward struggle. And that makes us a lot more interesting. We create this sort of inner space for ourselves with these priestly values. So he's when he's tracing this history of the concept of good and evil, he's looking at it in many different ways. So what the priestly values do, if we think about what aristocracy does, is they say we're powerful, right? They have material wealth, they're higher in status. And they say that's good. It's good to be us. It's good to have this high status. And priests are kind of denying materiality. They might have power, but they don't have the sort of material power that an aristocracy would have. And so Nietzsche says that reverses things. They take what is bad for life, like not eating, not having sex, and they make that good. And they take what is good for life, eating, having sex, and they make that bad, right? And he uses revenge as a sort of example of this. So if we think of if someone's harmed you, you can take revenge on them with the aristocracy and those sort of aristocratic values. But with a priest, you're supposed to be forgiving instead of taking revenge. And so Nietzsche sees this as kind of a life denial, not protecting yourself from others. And then we have a different iteration of good and evil, which Nietzsche calls the herd morality or slave morality. And this is after this is not an aristocratic value system, and it's also not a priestly value system. This is the system of values we get in place when he says the people have won, or the slaves, or the mob, or the herd, or whatever you like to call them. Now, from this, we get a sense that Nietzsche does not think very highly of the mob or the sort of commoner or the majority of people in the world, right? He's calling them herd, like they are thoughtless animals who just follow along with what others do. And this type of morality says that's what's good is whatever helps you fit in with the crowd. It's whatever is bad is what is different from the majority. And so essentially what this type of morality does is create norms that you follow. And you're supposed to be normal, you're supposed to fit in. And so it gets rid of individuality. And he says that the source of this is actually resentment, because the people who would stand out would be higher than you, right, or better than you. And so you resent them for being different than you. And so for Nietzsche, this is actually an expression of nihilism because it describes a sort of weariness of man. You want to erase individuality. You want to kind of melt into the whole. You want the melting pot, right? You don't want individuals to stand out and be different from each other. And he describes resentment kind of both with the priestly hatred of the world and hatred of human nature or human bodies and human urges. Um, and he also thinks that herd morality is really this manifestation of resentment. He says that with priests, they're the great haters in the world. They're the most ingenious haters, is what he calls them. They have this sort of, he says, poisonous hatred of things that is motivating a lot of their actions. And then with the herd or the commoner, the person who kind of fits into the crowd, he says that that person has resentment. Um, and it's a type of envy for things that you don't have. So it's not upright, it's not naive, it's not honest, it's not straightforward with yourself. You're not being honest with yourself. So with herd morality, instead of saying, I want to be powerful or I want to be rich, you say, rich people are evil or powerful people are evil. The master is evil, right? And what you're doing is you're resenting a position they have or you're resenting something good they have. But instead of trying to pursue that for yourself, you actually say that that thing is bad, right? So this is why he calls it the sort of slave morality, is the master becomes evil. So it's kind of complicated to think about this. But I mean, I think we observe this sometimes when we know someone who gossips a lot. I don't know if you have someone in your life who really likes to gossip and spill the tea about other people and talk about, air other people's dirty garbage or dirty laundry and kind of talk garbage about other people. But a lot of times that comes from a place of envy, right? Oh, look at her. She has an eating disorder, right? It might come from this place of someone who's actually insecure about their own looks or, you know, getting angry at someone for something they just purchased or talking about how much that car costs or something. That could also come from a position of insecurity about oneself and one's possessions. I mean, we can kind of see where Nietzsche's coming from with this, even though it seems terribly troubling to think of the morality that focuses on the common good and what we all have in common, right? That seems like it could be positive. And here we see Nietzsche kind of painting it in this bad light where it's coming from resentment and envy instead of actually caring about people and caring about community. So he also, in this, on the genealogy of morals, he also talks about not just the origins of the ideas of good and evil, but the origins of things like conscience and making a promise and guilt and punishment. And he says that the idea of punishment and guilt and conscience, these actually come from a creditor-debtor relationship. So they're based on this sort of money relation, so the German word for guilt is Schuld, and the German word for debt is Schulden. Like, so if I owe someone something, if I have Schulden, that's very similar to the word for guilt. And when we're talking about moral responsibility, we do use a lot of this language, right? What do we owe each other, right? How should I treat other people? We sometimes say, what do I owe other people? If I owe someone a punishment or if I owe someone a good action, right? So we use the same language when we talk about money. You lent me money, I owe you for it. And we see this in history as well with the way that a lot of punishment worked is it was like a compensation. The Merchant of Venice by Shakespeare gives us an example where we have the Merchant of Venice is in debt to Shylock. And this is, right, a very anti-Semitic play. It's problematic in many ways. But essentially, Shylock says, you owe me this much money, so you I can take a pound of flesh off your body if you don't pay it back. And this was a practice, right? This was something people did. If you couldn't pay back your monetary debts, they could torture you. They had a right to your physical body. Um, this is like a very old practice, right? So now I guess if you have a loan shark, they can like break your pinky or maybe physically beat you up, right? So there's some sense in which they're entitled to cause you physical harm. And Nietzsche says that there is pleasure in that. So it's not just that the pound of flesh, like the physical flesh you're taking away from that person, is equal to a certain amount of money. You're not going to be able to sell that flesh to anyone and make your money back. It's more the sort of pleasure you get in inflicting harm and pain and suffering on someone. And so, if this is the origin of the idea of punishment, then our notion of punishing a wrongdoer comes from a very dark place, because it's related to torture, right? It's not, I need to punish you to teach you to how to be a better person, or I'm punishing you because this is something that's good. It's not this sort of clean, pure act. Punishment comes from this sort of delight in torture for Nietzsche. So he makes a big deal out of the fact that there's a very long history of torture in many, many different cultures. Like every culture has some form of torture that is very much a public spectacle, where you don't just kill someone and, like this is your punishment. You would do all sorts of terrible things to their body. And in very inventive ways. So there's museums dedicated to medieval torture because they were very creative with it. So Nietzsche says that to see others suffer does one good, to make others suffer even more. This is a hard saying, but an ancient, mighty, human, all too human principle. Without cruelty, there is no festival. So he's thinking about the relationship between a lot of different festivals and what they have to do with like inflicting punishment and asserting a sort of code of conduct and a sort of cultural value. So if we think about what torture is doing in relation to moral values, it's creating a fixed idea. It is demonstrating something in a very memorable way. So Nietzsche connects torture to memory, and that's what conscience kind of is. Conscience is, when you feel the prick of conscience, you feel this sort of feeling of guilt and something hanging over your head. And Nietzsche thinks this is this sort of internalization of a sort of idea that suffering comes with particular action. So he says that man could never do without blood, torture, and sacrifices when he felt the need to make or create a memory for himself. So he's saying it's mnemonic. It helps us remember if we see something really torturous, full of blood, we're going to remember that. And so it has a way of stamping morality within our memories, within our minds, within who we are, if we see these sort of displays. This is kind of the premise for the Saw franchise, all these movies where we have a character named Jigsaw who finds people who he thinks have they have like a moral character flaw. And so he decides to torture them to teach them how to be good people. It's a weird movie. The movies are kind of weird, but this is essentially what Jigsaw, the character, is trying to do. You might have read Nietzsche and taken it too seriously. So if we put this together, if we're thinking about, okay, Nietzsche is telling us this history, he's using language, he's using etymology to show us that good and evil are not these pure concepts of being loving, being devoted to others, community, sharing in the common good, building a society together. They actually have more to do with blood and enjoying cruelty. They have things to do with owing money to someone. They have a lot to do with power relations, whether that's a money relation or a social status. So really, what do we do with this? If this is what good and evil mean, how do we form values? Like if we can look at the values in life and see that, well, these actually serve a different purpose than we thought they did, they're functioning in a different way, then how do we create a sort of moral value for who we are now? For people who can look back at history and see all these different things and who can look across many different cultures and see very like many different ideas of what is good and evil. So Nietzsche's trying to get us to think about what morality is and what it can be by showing us that there's nothing really holding morality together. There's nothing that demands this is good for all people in all circumstances at all times, and this is what is evil in all circumstances and at all times. Instead, it's very contingent, and we play a huge role in defining what it is. So, morality is very fluid. There are certain practices that arise, and we give meaning and value to them. And so, we can think about what we want to give meaning and value to. So, that's the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche is obviously a moral relativist, but he's not a nihilist in the sense that he thinks nothing matters and we shouldn't care. Instead, he is asking us to reevaluate values. He's saying we have this sort of power to create values and we can do something with that. Okay, if you have any questions about the reading for this week, feel free to send me an email or set up a time to talk. I'm very much looking forward to what you have to say in the discussion boards, and I'm available to talk about anything if you have any questions. Thank you so much.